I have never trusted a quiet room, and the antechamber of the Concord of Cyril was the quietest room I had ever stood in. It was built to be quiet. The dome overhead was a single poured sheet of clarified silicate 200 meters across, and beyond it the station's dayside turned slowly against the black, so that the whole hall was washed in a flat, honest daylight with no shadows sharp enough to hide in. The Concord had designed it that way on purpose. 9 species had signed the founding accord in this room, and every one of them had insisted, as a condition of trust, that there be nowhere in the chamber a knife could be concealed, and no corner a lie could stand in. The floor was pale gray marble veined with a mineral that fluoresced faintly under the light. The tiered seats ran up in concentric rings. At the center, on a low dais, sat the signing table, and on the signing table lay the treaty that was to give humanity its permanent seat. I was Tomas Rek, third liaison to the human delegation, which is a grand way of saying I carried the water and remembered the names. I had been in the service 11 years. I had learned in that time that the important thing in any chamber is not the person speaking but the people who are too still, and that morning I could not stop counting how many Kersh attendants were too still along the eastern gallery. There were 11 of them. There should have been 4. I did not say anything. It was not my place to say anything, and Envoy Cade had trained me out of the habit of narrating my nerves years ago. But I noted it the way you note a smell you cannot name, and I filed it, and I went back to standing where a liaison stands, half a pace behind and to the right of the woman I served. Envoy Marisol Cade was 61 years old and looked like someone's aunt who had run a hardware store for 40 years and buried 2 husbands without complaint. She was not tall. She was not sharp-featured. She wore the plain charcoal coat of the human service with no decoration, but the small enamel pin at her collar, and she had spent the last quarter hour drinking tea from a steel cup and reading the treaty she already knew by heart. She did not look like the most feared diplomat in 3 coalitions. That was rather the point of her. At her feet, taking up more floor than a diplomat has any right to bring into a treaty hall, lay Otto. Otto was a Newfoundland. If you have never seen one, imagine a black bear that has decided, after long reflection, that violence is beneath it. He weighed more than I did by a comfortable margin. His coat was the deep matte black of wet slate, thick enough to lose your whole hand in, and his face had gone gray around the muzzle and over the eyes in the way of a very old dog who has decided he has seen everything worth being surprised by. He lay on the marble beside Cade's chair with his enormous head on his paws, and he breathed in long, slow bellows that you could hear from across the dais, and every so often he sighed the way a house settles at night, and a thin rope of drool descended from his jowl toward the fluorescing marble with the patience of a stalactite. He had been to 9 signings. He slept through most of them. The Kersh delegate found this offensive, and had for the better part of a year made his offense into a strategy. His name was Ashen Vale, and he was magnificent in the way that certain predators are magnificent right up until the moment they are not. The Kersh are tall, a head and a half above a tall human, and plated in a segmented chitin that ranges from ivory to a burnished bronze, and they move with a dry, articulated grace that the softer species in the Concord find beautiful and the harder ones find unsettling. Vale's plates were the pale gold of high birth, filed and lacquered, and he carried his 4-jointed arms folded before him with the studied ease of a man who has never once in his life been made to wait. He had a way of tilting his long head that made you feel measured and found insufficient. He was, by every account, brilliant. He had unseated 2 rivals and 1 patron on his climb to the Kersh seat, and he had done it, I was told, without ever raising his voice, which is the sort of detail you should always take seriously. For 11 months, Vale had been telling the Concord a story. The story was this, that the human reputation was a fraud, that the word death world, which the humans wore so lightly and which the softer species repeated in the corridors with a delicious little shiver, was propaganda, a bluff dressed as biology, a marketing of menace by a species that had arrived late and small, and needed the other members frightened of it in order to be seated at all. He did not say humans were weak. That would have been too easy to disprove, and Vale was not a man who left himself easy to disprove. He said instead that humans were ordinary. Clever, yes. Adaptable, certainly. But ordinary, a warm-blooded biped from a temperate world with an inflated legend and a talent for theater. And the theater, he said, the centerpiece of the whole performance, was the animal. He never named Otto. He was too careful for that. He spoke of it in the abstract, in committee and in corridor and in the long ceremonial dinners where the real work of the conquered is done between courses. The human envoy, he would say, brings a beast to every signing and lets the room believe it is a monster. She lets you believe your own fear. And you, honored colleagues, you have never once seen it do a single thing except sleep. Is that the apex of a death world? Is that the terror the humans have sold you? A fat old animal that drools on the marble and could not, I think, be roused to climb a flight of stairs. It was good. I have to give him that. It was very good because it was almost entirely true. Nobody in that chamber had ever seen Otto do anything. That was the whole architecture of the human reputation, the implication, never the demonstration, and Vale had understood, better than anyone I had met, that an implication is a debt, and that a debt can be called. He meant to call it. I did not yet understand how, that morning, but I understood that he meant to, because you do not station 7 extra attendants along an eastern gallery to watch a signing you intend to lose. Cade set down her tea. She reached down without looking and laid the flat of her hand on the broad black slope of Otto's skull, and the old dog's tail lifted from the marble and swept once, twice, a slow, heavy arc that dragged across the stone with a sound like a broom, and settled again. She did not say anything to me. She rarely did in a chamber. But she caught my eye for half a second, and she had seen the 11 attendants too, and she was not concerned, and the fact that she was not concerned concerned me more than the attendants had. I had served her for 11 years, and I had learned to read the difference between the calm of a woman who does not see the danger and the calm of a woman who sees it, and has already decided it does not change anything. This was the second kind. It always was with her. I found, standing there in that bright, honest room with my throat gone dry, that I did not know which of us had read the morning correctly, and that I would have given a year of pay to. The conquered speaker called the chamber to order. The speaker was a Melu, one of the cephalopod scholars, mounted in a suspended armature of clarified fluid that let its long soft body hang at the height of the dais, while its manipulator limbs handled the ceremonial instruments. The Melu are the memory of the conquered. They keep the record. They read the accords aloud. They are trusted because they want nothing and outlive everyone. Its voice came from a resonator at the base of the armature, flat and courteous and translated into a dozen tongues at once. The conquered of Serral convenes, it said, to receive the human accession to the founding accord. Let the record show all 9 seats present. Let the record show the human delegation seated in good faith. There was a formality to it, a long, slow liturgy of names and precedences, and I let it wash over me while I watched the Eastern Gallery. Vale sat in the carriage seat with his gold plates catching the daylight, and he was the picture of a delegate composed for a solemn occasion, and only once, did I see his long head tilt a fraction toward a point low on the eastern wall, toward a service gate set into the marble at the base of the tiers, a maintenance access no larger than a doorway, sealed and forgotten. I had walked the chamber that morning as I always did, and I had checked that gate as I always did, and it had been locked and cold and its indicator dark. Its indicator was no longer dark, it was amber. I felt the morning tilt under me the way a floor tilts in a dream. I leaned the smallest fraction toward Cade, not a step. Nothing a gallery would read, just a shift of weight, and I said, low, under the speaker's liturgy, the 4 words I had been trained never to say in a chamber unless they were true. The East Gate's live. She did not turn her head. She reached down again and laid her hand on Otto's skull and the old dog sighed, and she said, so quietly that I felt it more than heard it, I know. Stand where you are, Tomas. Whatever happens, you stand where you are and you keep your hands still. Ma'am. Your hands still, she said. That's the whole job today. And the speaker finished the liturgy, and the treaty was brought forward, and Vale rose in the carriage seat to make the customary objection that precedes every accession. A ritual, a formality, the last chance for any member to speak against a new seat before the record closes. And I understood, with the cold falling clarity you get exactly 1 instant too late to be useful, that the objection was not going to be a formality at all. Vale spoke well. He always spoke well. He did not attack. He was too clever to attack the humans directly with the whole conquered watching. You do not accuse a deathworld species of fraud in open chamber, and hope the room takes your side out of reason. Reason was never his instrument. He worked instead on the soft thing under the reason, the thing every species in that hall carried whether they admitted it or not, which was the quiet unspoken hope that the humans were not, after all, quite as dangerous as the corridor stories said. He gave them permission to hope it. He was gentle about it. He praised the humans, their patience, their adaptability, their long journey to this table, and he wove the praise so full of small, careful holes that by the end of it the chamber was full of a doubt it did not know it had picked up. We have taken much on faith, he said, and his translated voice was warm, almost fond. We have seated our fears beside us for years and called them respect. I ask only, before the record closes forever, that we be honest with ourselves about what we fear. Is it the human, or is it the story the human has been kind enough to let us tell? He let his long head turn, slow, toward Cade's chair, toward the black shape on the marble. I have watched this animal at 9 signings, he said. I have watched it sleep through the founding of a peace. I do not doubt the human's affection for it. I doubt only our own credulity. We are the conquered of Serral. We do not seat legends. We seat facts. And I would ask the chamber, with all respect to our new colleagues, whether we have ever once been shown a fact or only ever been shown a very old dog. It was the best speech I ever heard aimed at destroying someone, and it very nearly worked. And the reason it very nearly worked was that every word of it was true, and none of it was the point. Cade did not rise to answer. That was the first thing. The chamber waited for her to rise. The objection is answered by the acceding party. That is the form. And she did not rise. She sat in her plain charcoal coat with her steel cup empty at her elbow and her hand resting on the black slope of Otto's back, and she let the silence stretch until it began to embarrass the people who had enjoyed Vale's speech. And then she said, in a voice that carried without effort because she did not force it, "You're right, delegate, you've never been shown a fact. That was a courtesy. I'd assumed you'd all prefer it." And she picked up her stylus, and she leaned forward to sign. That, I have come to believe, was the moment Vale gave the signal, not because her words wounded him, but because they didn't, because she was reaching for the treaty as though his 11 months were already over, and a man like Vale cannot bear to be made irrelevant a half-second before his masterpiece. I did not see the signal. I have gone over it 100 times and I never saw it. But I saw its consequence, because at the base of the eastern tiers the amber indicator on the service gate went green, and the gate opened, and the alarm that should have accompanied it did not sound. That was the tell in the end, not the gate, the silence of the gate. Someone had gone to a great deal of trouble to make the most dangerous thing that could happen in that chamber happen without a warning, and there is only one reason to silence an alarm, and it is not safety. The thing that came out of the gate was called a dray. I had never seen one. Few outside the Kersh military castes had. It came low and fast and wrong, a hunting animal bred by a hunting people for the single purpose of running down things that fled, and everything about it was built around that purpose. It was the length of a horse and the height of a large dog, and it moved on 6 limbs that folded and reached in a gait that the eye could not quite hold, a flicker, a pore of muscle under a hide of overlapping bronze scutes the same color as Vale's highborn plates. It had no face to speak of, only a wedge of jaw and a band of clustered black eyes, and it made no sound at all, which was the most frightening thing about it, because everything that size should make a sound and it made none. It came out of the gate into the bright, honest daylight of the conquered chamber, and it stopped once at the base of the tiers, and it turned its wedge of head slowly across the room, and the room understood all at once what it was looking for. The chamber came apart. I want to be precise about this, because the precision is the point. The chamber did not panic the way a mob panics. It came apart along the exact lines Vale had drawn. The soft delegations, the mellow speaker hauling its armature up and back, the small furred Eilish in the third ring, the reed-thin Anu with their glass instruments, those broke and fled and cried out, and their fear was real, and it was loud, and it filled the dome with a rising, overlapping wail that the translators could not keep up with. And the hard delegations, the Kersh, of course, but also the Dren in their heavy seats, the plated fighting species who had been quietly told, I have no doubt, that there might be a demonstration today. Those did not flee. Those sat and watched and waited to see what the humans would do, because that was the whole trap, and I understood it now in its awful symmetry. If the dog panicked, if the fat old animal Vale had spent a year describing bolted or coward or was, God help it, run down and killed on the marble in front of the conquered, then the myth died with it, and the humans were exposed as frauds who had let a beast of burden pose as a monster, and their seat was finished. And if the humans reacted, if they drew a weapon, if the envoy's people cut the dray down with the sidearms the Kersh knew perfectly well we were carrying under our coats, then the humans had brought lethal violence into the sacred, disarmed chamber of the conquered of Serral, had proven themselves exactly the dangerous animals the corridor stories claimed, unfit to be trusted with a seat, a species that answered a frightened beast with murder. And the Kersh would rise, grave and sorrowful, and observe that they had worn the chamber, and the seat would be finished that way instead. Heads the humans lose, tails the humans lose. It was, I will say it plainly, the most elegant thing I have ever had turned against me, and I have thought about it every day since, because I stood there in the middle of it with a sidearm under my coat and a scream climbing my own throat, and I understood that every instinct I had was a door Vale had already built. The dray came across the chamber. It came for the dais. It came for the humans, because that was where the handler's goad had pointed it, and because the humans were the only things in the room not fleeing, and a hunting animal turns toward the still thing the way water turns downhill. It flowed up over the first tier and the second, and it crossed the pale marble in that awful soundless flicker, and the daylight ran silver along the bronze scutes of its back, and I could see the individual black eyes now, wet, and the wedge of its jaw parted the width of my two hands, and it was 10 meters away, and then 6, and then 4, and it was coming straight at the low black shape asleep beside my envoy's chair, and I had my hand inside my coat before I knew I had moved. Tomas. Just my name. Not loud. She did not even turn her head to say it. She said my name the way you'd say it across a kitchen, and I stopped with my fingers on the grip of a weapon I had been trained since boyhood to draw in exactly this circumstance. And I stopped because in 11 years I had never once heard her be wrong about anything that mattered, and I made the hardest decision of my life, which was to trust that she was not wrong now. I took my hand out of my coat. I let it fall to my side. I stood where I was and I kept my hand still. And I watched a war beast bred to run down the fleeing cross the last 4 meters of marble toward a sleeping dog. And I did the one thing my whole life had trained me never to do, which was nothing. Cade did not move at all. She sat with her stylus in her hand, poised over the treaty, and she watched the dray come with an expression I can only call polite, the mild, attentive courtesy of a woman watching a colleague cross a room to shake her hand. And she did not reach for Otto, and she did not speak to Otto, and she did not so much as tighten her hand where it rested on his back. Otto opened one eye. I was close enough to see it. The dray was 2 meters out, one, close enough that I could smell it now. A dry, hot mineral reek like a struck flint. And the old Newfoundland lifted his great gray-muzzled head off his paws, slow, unbothered, the way he lifted it when a steward came too near his water bowl. And he looked at the thing pouring across the marble toward him out of soft brown eyes gone cloudy at the rims with age. And he did not rise. He did not stand. He did not so much as gather his legs beneath him. He simply lifted his head and looked, and the look was not fear and it was not challenge. It was the flat, incurious, faintly put upon attention of something very old and very large being approached by something it has not yet decided is worth the trouble of being awake for. The dray stopped. It stopped as though it had run into glass. One instant it was a flowing thing of muscle and hunting purpose, and the next it was arrested mid-stride, all 6 limbs braced, its wedge of head thrown up and back, and the band of black eyes fixed on the black shape on the marble, and a shudder went down the length of its bronze hide from jaw to tail, a long rolling flinch, and it made, for the first time, a sound. It was a low sound. It came from somewhere deep in the animal, below the jaw, and it was not a growl and it was not a threat. Anyone who has ever been near an animal that has met something it did not expect and did not want to fight knows the sound. It is the sound of a thing recalculating. It is the sound of instinct arriving, all at once and far too late, at a fact the higher functions had been assured did not exist. And then the dray, the Kersh war beast, bred for 100 generations to run down and kill, loosed into a disarmed chamber to expose a fraud, lowered itself to the marble. It did not lie down the way Otto lay down, sprawled and easy. It lowered itself the way a lesser thing lowers itself before a greater, its head going down between its braced forelimbs, its band of black eyes rolling to keep the old dog in sight, its whole bronze bulk sinking against the pale stone in a posture that every species in that chamber, whatever their biology, understood on sight because it is written into every predator that ever competed with a bigger one for a kill. It was deference. It was submission. It was an apex predator meeting a more senior apex predator and declining, wholly and instantly and without being asked, to make it a contest. And Otto sighed, and put his head back down on his paws and closed his eye and went back to sleep. The chamber had gone silent. I did not notice when. The wailing had stopped, the fleeing had stopped. The whole vast bright dome of the Concord of Serral had frozen into a single held breath, 9 species and their attendants and their memory and their fear, all fixed on the 2 animals at the foot of the human envoy's chair. One of them the deadliest thing the Kersh could field, and the other a fat old dog who had already gone back to sleep. A thin new rope of drool descended from Otto's jowl toward the marble. It was, I think, the loudest silence I will ever stand in. Cade signed the treaty. She did it without hurry in the frozen hush, the scratch of the stylus enormous in that silence, her plain, sensible signature going down at the foot of the accord that seated her species forever. And then she set the stylus down beside her empty steel cup, and she folded her hands and she looked, for the first time since the gate had opened, at Delegate Ashen Vale. "You wanted a fact, Delegate," she said. "There it is, asleep. It'll want its dinner in an hour. If your people would be so kind as to retrieve theirs." She nodded mild at the deferring dray before it embarrasses itself further. "I think we can consider the objection answered." I have tried many times to describe what happened to Vale in that moment, and I have never gotten it right because nothing happened to him. That was the terrible thing. Nothing happened. He did not cry out. He was not seized or accused or struck down. He simply sat in the high Kersh seat with his gold plates catching the honest daylight, and the whole chamber looked at him, and the whole chamber understood at the same instant every part of what he had done. Because there is no other reason for a war beast to be behind a silenced gate, and no other reason for 11 attendants where there should be 4, and no other outcome he could possibly have wanted from losing that thing into that room. The conquered looked at Vale, and Vale looked back, and he watched 11 months of the most patient and elegant work of his life become, In the space of 4 seconds and a dog's sigh, the single most compromising thing anyone in that hall had ever seen. He had built the trap on one belief and staked everything he was on it, and the belief was that the death world was a myth. And his own beast, his own bred and blooded hunting animal, the instrument of his masterpiece, had just crossed a treaty chamber and lain down in front of the whole conquered and told them, in the only language that cannot lie, that the myth was true. The proof had been in the room the whole time. It had been drooling on the marble. He had spent a year telling them it was a prop, and he had been so certain, so brilliantly and completely certain, that he had reached out and pulled the one lever that would make it demonstrate itself. The Melu speaker recovered first, because the Melu always recover first. It is why they keep the record. Its armature descended back to the height of the dais. Its soft body pulsing with what I have since learned is the Melu equivalent of a very carefully suppressed reaction, and its flat courteous voice came out into the silence. The chamber will note, it said, an unscheduled release of a controlled animal from a service gate under Kersh warrant with the local alarm disabled. A pause. The record is very precise. The chamber will note that the human delegation did not respond with force. The chamber will note that and here even the Melu's translator hesitated, hunting for a word, that the situation resolved without injury to any party. Another pause. The record is open for the Kersh delegation to explain the release. Vale did not explain the release. There was no explanation that survived being said aloud. To claim it an accident was to admit the Kersh could not secure their own beasts inside a treaty chamber, which was its own kind of ruin. To claim it a demonstration was to confess the whole design in front of the memory of the conquered. He was, for the first time in 11 months, and I think for the first time in a very long life of never once being made to wait, entirely out of good moves. He had built a trap with 2 jaws and both of them had closed, and neither of them had closed on the humans. He rose. He was graceful even then, I will grant him that to the end. He inclined his long gold head, first to the speaker and then very slightly to Cade, and he said, in a voice from which every warmth had drained and left only the dry articulate cold beneath, the Kersh delegation withdraws its objection. And then, because he could not help himself, because a man like that must land one last touch or die. The animal is well trained. My compliments to the trainer. Cade did not smile. She had never in 11 years wasted a smile on a man who was already finished. He's not trained, delegate, she said. That's rather the whole point. You can't train a thing to be what it already is. You can only fail to notice it for as long as it lets you. She reached down and laid her hand once more on the broad black slope of Otto's back, and the old dog's tail lifted and swept the marble once, twice, and settled. He's been in this room for 9 signings. He was under the table the whole time. You were all so busy being frightened of the story that not one of you ever thought to be frightened of the dog. She picked up her empty steel cup and turned it in her fingers, and I swear the small dry click of it was louder in that hall than any speech had been. You were closer to the truth than any of them, delegate. You knew we'd let you believe it. You just never once considered that we'd let you believe it because it didn't matter whether you did. The Kersh handlers came for the dray then, moving low and slow and very carefully, and the war beast let itself be collared and led away without ever taking its band of black eyes off the sleeping shape by the envoy's chair. And it went out through the silence gate the way it had come. And someone at last remembered to sound the all clear that should have sounded 20 minutes before, and the sound of it was almost funny. A bright, polite chime announcing that the danger everyone had already survived was now officially over. I did not move from where I stood. My hand ached. I looked down and found that I had, at some point I could not name, made a fist so hard the nails had left half-moons in my palm. The hand I had not been allowed to use, the fist I had made instead of drawing, and I opened it slowly and let the feeling come back into it. And I understood a little of what Cade had meant all those years, when she said the whole job was to keep your hands still. It is easy to draw. Anyone can draw. The trap was built for a species that would draw. The one thing Vale's whole elegant year had not planned for was a room that would simply do nothing, and be right too. The signing concluded in its proper forms. The Concord seated humanity that day, and the record shows it seated us in good faith, and the record shows, because the Melu keep a very precise record, the exact sequence of the Kersh warrant, and the silenced alarm, and the 11 attendants, and the war beast that crossed a disarmed treaty chamber and lay down before a domestic animal from Earth, and declined to make it a contest. That record did more to Ashen Vale in the following season than any human ever did. We never lifted a hand against him. We never had to. He had written the instrument of his own undoing and signed it with his own warrant, and the Concord is very patient and very precise, and it does not forget a delegate who loosed a killing beast beneath its dome and called it an accident. He held his seat another year. He did not hold it well. I am told he no longer sits at all. We do not speak of it as a victory in the service. Cade would not have allowed it. On the shuttle back she sat with the empty steel cup between her palms and Otto's great head heavy across her boots, and she was quiet for a long while, and then she said to the window and not to me, "It's a bad habit, Tomas, being frightened of the story. Vale had a good mind, best I've faced. He just spent it all on the wrong thing." She looked down at the old dog sleeping across her feet, at the gray muzzle and the cloudy eyes and the thin thread of drool darkening the shuttle floor. They spend years learning to read us, our faces, our fleets, our stories, and it never once occurs to a single one of them to just look at the dog. She scratched Otto behind one heavy ear, and the tail thumped the deck slow twice. "He's not a monster. He never was. He's a good boy who likes his dinner and doesn't much care for stairs." The monster was never the dog. She set the cup down. The monster was assuming we'd draw. I have thought about that a great deal in the years since, on the long postings and the quiet nights, and I have never improved on it, so I will leave it where she left it. They built a trap with 2 jaws, and staked a very good mind on a very old lie, and loosed the deadliest thing they had into a room to prove that the danger was a story. And the danger opened one eye and looked at them, and decided they were not worth standing up for. And then he went back to sleep.